might be joining us today. Welcome to this webinar on renewing democracy to tackle the climate crisis, jointly hosted by the Centre for Public Integrity and the Melbourne School of Government. I am joining you from the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. As we embark on a discussion about how democracy can be renewed to tackle the climate crisis, we must acknowledge that First Nations people are those who are on the front line of this crisis, and it is already having a significant impact on them, their country, and their culture. As the Torres Strait Islander plaintiffs in the Australian climate case argue, losing their homeland due to rising sea levels would amount to cultural genocide. It is beyond contestation that failure to avoid catastrophic global warming would be devastating. But is democracy up to the task? Law and democracy expert, Prof Joo-Sheong Tham, and independent MP Zali Steggel are going to help us navigate this question with the assistance of Adam Morton, Guardian Australia's climate and environment editor. Adam recently helped make Guardian Australia podcast series Australia versus the Climate, on how Australia's behaviour across decades has made it an outcast at climate negotiations, and is currently covering the COP26 Climate Summit from a distance. Adam, thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and great to be with you all. I'm joining you from Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which was never ceded. As Catherine said, I'm currently working a backwards life, pretending I'm in Glasgow without being there. So if I act like it's 1 a.m. and lose the plot a little, please forgive me in advance. But it's really great to be with you all. And I think we're going to hear some fascinating stuff today and hopefully have a good discussion at the end. And I look forward to seeing your questions, which we'll share with the panel after we initially hear from them. But we should get straight into it. So allow me to introduce the first speaker today, who is Professor Joo-Sheong Tham. Joo-Sheong is a professor at Melbourne Law School and a leading expert on law and democracy and the regulation of political finance. He's published more than 40 refereed articles and book chapters, and in 2010 published his book, Money and Politics, The Democracy We Can't Afford. He has written key reports for the New South Wales Electoral Commission on the regulation of political finance and lobbying. And in 2012, he became the inaugural director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. He's also a founding director of the Centre for Public Integrity. It's great to have him with us. Joo-Sheong, over to you.
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you so much to the Centre for Public Integrity and the Melbourne School of Government for organising this. And like Catherine and Adam, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various unceded lands upon which we meet. Now I'm going to try the ambitious task of trying to share my screen. Okay. Did that work, Adam? Yeah. Okay, excellent. It is hard not to feel that Australian democracy has failed on climate change. Australia is amongst the highest per capita emitters of greenhouse gases internationally, and also amongst the most vulnerable in the OECD. And yet, it's a climate laggard. It's a climate laggard internationally, with the government only committing to net zero by 2050 last week. It's also a laggard domestically, with all states and territories committed to net zero by 2050 some time ago. And then there are the climate wars, which have contributed to the ousting of 3 prime ministers since 2007. One casualty has been carbon pricing, which is now considered a pariah policy, despite being supported by most economists and the International Monetary Fund recently saying that, to quote, putting a robust price on carbon lies at the heart of any comprehensive policy package to deal with global warming. So when we come to a question posed by this seminar, should Australian democracy be renewed to tackle the climate crisis? In my view, the answer is emphatically yes. Leading thinkers like Rebecca Huntley and Professor Ross Garnaut have said the same. George Magaloginis has similarly argued that a new model of government is required in the climate crisis. So the key question for me is less whether Australian democracy should be renewed to tackle the climate crisis, but how? And it's this question I'd like to address. And my presentation falls into two parts: diagnosis and prescription. Drawing upon the work of David Held and Angus Hervey, I highlight three circumstances of democratic debilitation that hinder Australian democracy in effectively tackling the climate crisis: short-termism, self-referring mechanisms, and capture by vested interests. And I'll set aside the fourth circumstance identified by Held and Harvey, weak multilateralism, even though it's a profoundly important consideration that is on display with the Glasgow COP. What I will argue in terms of prescription is that these three corrosive tendencies can be countered by three pillars of democratic renewal: a planning state, a solidaristic ethos, and fair and inclusive politics. When we come to short-termism, we can appreciate, of course, that the climate crisis is characterized by long time frames, a temporal distance between greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, as well as between measures taken to address climate change and their effects. And short-termism clearly militates against these timeframes. There is compelling evidence of short-termism in Australian climate politics. We can, of course, point to the very belated commitment to net zero by 2050. More importantly, perhaps, is the underlying orientation of short-termism. In the government's the plan to deliver net zero the Australian way, there is a statement which gives us an entry point to understanding this orientation, where it is said, to quote, "We will not put industries, regions, or jobs at risk." Now, the impact of climate action, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation on jobs, industries, and regions, are, of course, legitimate and significant considerations. But the problem here is that the focus seems to be on current jobs and industries and not putting them at risk. But the crisis will result in what the Treasurer George Frydenberg has characterized as significant structural change. A recent Grattan Institute report said that getting to net zero will arguably be the biggest economic transformation Australia has seen outside of wartime. And according to the International Labour Organization research paper, the impact on the world of work will be, in its words, akin to an industrial revolution. Now, where then are the meaningful plans for jobs and industries in a climate-safe economy? Specifically, where is the plan for the phasing out of fossil fuel industries? As the Australian government itself acknowledges in its plan, there will be dramatic reductions in global demand for coal and gas. And yet, we have many fossil fuel projects under development, literally in the pipeline. The changing economics of energy production will in fact see more closures of coal-fired plants. 3 more, including Yallourn, are slated for closure before 2030, and the Australian Energy Market Operator projects most of Australia's 20-odd coal-fired plants will close over the next 2 decades. Without credible plans to address such closures, stranded assets will likely lead to stranded communities. And part of the fundamental difficulty here is what Marion Wilkinson has dubbed the no regrets policy, prevailing in both major parties since the Howard government. The rule that climate action should not result in costs to Australia's economy in the short term, especially on its fossil fuel industries. That the negative impact on fossil fuel industries have been prioritized is no coincidence. And this is a point I'll come back to when discussing capture by vested interests. Let me turn to the second circumstance of democratic debilitation: self-referring decision-making. And this is said to arise from democratic mechanisms particularly elections, which are underpinned by accountability to constituents of a particular nation state, and in fact, more specifically, accountability to current voters, which are only a section of the present generation. And to these mechanisms, we can also add the politics of self-interest, whether it be sectional or individual. When we understand these self-referring mechanisms, we can see how it militates against effective climate action at two levels. It can work against the global cooperation necessary to deal with this global existential challenge. It can also work against cooperation within the country necessary to deal with the complex dimensions of the crisis. And again, there are signs of such debilitation. There is barely concealed nationalism in the current government's climate policy. The Prime Minister, in announcing the plan to develop net zero the Australian way, stated that we won't be lectured by others who do not understand Australia. And the climate wars have distorted different interests, and which of course, there are a whole range of diverse and different interests, but they've distorted them into irreconcilable interests, providing a platform for political polarization and for politicians who exploit division for electoral gain. So we have divisiveness and conflicts, many of them unnecessary, and false trade-offs between protecting jobs on one hand and protecting the environment. Conflicts between the regions and the cities, conflicts between blue-collar workers and white-collar workers. Let me come to the third circumstance of democratic debilitation. And David Attenborough, in fact, pointed to this third circumstance when he suggested that vested interests are the most formidable obstacle, in his words, to switching to clean energy. Professor Ross Garnaut, who wrote 2 comprehensive reports on climate change, has observed in Australia, emissions-intensive industries have invested heavily to influence climate change policy since the early days of discussion of these issues. Investment for influence. And so it has been. The resources industry is by far the largest sector making political contributions. And you can see this, in fact, by the systematic research undertaken by the Center for Public Integrity. And we see here, through this dependence on major parties on contributions by the resources industry, signs of what the High Court in the McCloy decision has characterized as clientelistic corruption. The success of the $22 million advertising campaign by mining companies against the Rudd government's resource super profits tax is part of political folklore. So much so that it's now routine for industry groups to threaten so-called mining tax style campaign every time they don't get their way. And here we see signs of what the High Court in McCloy has characterized as war chest corruption. And we have employees and lobbyists of fossil fuel companies, which has included former ALP ministers, senior ministers, and former senior Liberal Party ministers. With such power comes profound impact. So much so that the term policy capture, as used by the OECD, is not inapt. Marion Wilkinson's book, The Carbon Club, in this context, provides a meticulous and compelling account of how a network of climate science skeptics, politicians, and business leaders brought about decades of climate inaction in Australia. And one particular example that sticks in my mind is that under the Howard government, climate change policy was determined by a group of fossil fuel lobbyists, many of whom were former senior public servants, who likened themselves to organized crime through a self-styled label: greenhouse mafia. Let me repeat, this was a self-styled label. And perhaps the most singular fact, fossil fuel companies have played an instrumental role in ousting 2 out of 5 prime ministers we have had since 2007, Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. Now, these 3 circumstances of democratic debilitation highlight how the climate crisis is at once a crisis for Australian democracy. Debilitation, however, does not spell despair. As Jared Diamond has pointed out, a crisis is a turning point, a moment of truth, with extreme danger, of course, but also significant opportunity. What is then called for is not pessimism, less fatalism of democracy, but rather a deepening of the democratic impulse, specifically a grounded affirmation of the strengths of the democratic institutions in Australia, framed with a clear-eyed view of the enormity and complexity of the climate crisis. So whilst powerfully real, the three circumstances of democratic debilitation can, in my view, be countered by three pillars of democratic renewal. In its recent report, the Business Council of Australia, in its report, Achieving a Net Zero Economy, said, to achieve a net zero economy by 2050, the nation needs an unprecedented level of coordination with bipartisan support to align and accelerate investment signals, enhance regulation, and provide much needed policy certainty for businesses and communities. Now, what you see in that brief statement is elements of what Anthony Giddens has characterized as a planning state, and really a planning state that to counter the short-termism that is a tendency in terms of modern democratic politics. And you see up in the slide, there are four elements of a planning state. There's planning, there's regulation economy, there's coordination and integration, and you see it with the BCA statement, and there's also holistic risk mitigation. What this element points to is both the necessity and centrality of government or the state in addressing the climate crisis. And that's not too hard to comprehend. Yeah? The 2006 Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, and in Australia, the 2008 Garnaut Climate Change Review, characterized climate change as, in their words, the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. And we in fact see gestures towards a planning state in the current government's policies with a plethora of plans, including the plan to deliver net zero the Australian way, Australia's long-term emissions reduction plans, and so on and so forth. But these remain gestures. Now, as Adam has rightly observed in one of his many pieces, there's actually no actual plan in a sense of a roadmap to net zero. The states, in fact, show us a way to an effective planning state in the climate crisis. The elements that Giddens identifies are present, for instance, in the New South Wales Climate Change Policy Framework and the Directions for Climate Smart South Australia. And they're present too in Zali's climate change bills, which Zali will speak to very shortly. What I will highlight from Zali's framework legislation is how it emphasizes that planning in the climate crisis is a democratic enterprise. So one of the key principles of Zali's bill is community engagement and self-determination. And this is in line with what the International Energy Agency has stated, that in this transition, in its words, citizens must be active participants in the entire process, making them feel part of the transition and not simply subject to it. Now, the vital importance of democratic planning, as reflected in Zali's bill, should not be downplayed. The crisis is a societal and existential challenge that implicates a complex range of issues, not just technical aspects, but social, economic, and political and environmental dimensions, making it all the more imperative for our collective wisdom to be harnessed. Second pillar, a solidaristic ethos. And this pillar is to counter the self-referring mechanisms I discussed early on. Now, such an ethos should be broad and inclusive, encompassing, as Pope Francis has reasoned, intergenerational and intragenerational solidarity, solidarity within and amongst nations, and most demanding, I think, solidarity with nature. Now, what is often neglected is that solidarity is a democratic principle. Now, the intergovernmental organization dedicated to democracy and electoral assistance, International IDEA, has explained in its words, solidarity refers to the ties in a society that bind different people together, expressing social bonds rather than autonomous individual ties. Now, with such a perspective, a solidaristic ethos, voters are not just protectors of their own interests, but also trustees for the public interest, broadly conceived. And we see a resonance here between what International IDEA has said and how Pope Francis has characterized solidarity, which in his view centrally means, in his words, thinking and acting in terms of community. We can see too here a close connection between solidarity and the third neglected principle of the French Revolution, fraternity. And there's great power in this connection, not only because, as Pope Francis has said, that we all have an innate sense of fraternity, but as the Dalai Lama has argued, fraternity will, in his words, breathe new life into democracy. And here I want to draw out two implications of democratic solidarity in the climate crisis: voice and social protection. Communities that are particularly affected by climate change and climate action, frontline communities must have a meaningful voice from this perspective. Now, this includes Indigenous peoples, as Dr. Catherine Williams has pointed out in her introductory comments, but also communities in regional Australia suffering from drought, water scarcity, bushfires, as well as fossil fuel dependent communities. In the world of work, where there will be extensive industry and job restructuring, it means putting in place what the International Labour Organization has characterized as social dialogue, which is one of the 4 pillars of the ILO's decent work agenda. Now, social dialogue is integral to the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce. And I use that phrase as stipulated in the preamble of the 2015 Paris Agreement, or what in Zali's bill is referred to as a fair employment transition. Now, a just transition in the climate crisis, in the words of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which leaves no one behind, brings to the fore the role of social protection, which is another pillar of the ILO's decent work agenda. Now, social protection is democratically necessary as democratic communities depend on social cohesion for their effective functioning. This is especially so given the scale, depth, and pace of change involved in the climate crisis. The crisis will, according to the IPCC, require, in its words, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. So how can we provide social protection in the climate crisis? Well, here are some ideas. We need dedicated plans for particularly affected communities. So the Business Council, for example, has called for a low-carbon regional roadmap. The Australian Council of Trade Unions has advocated for plans to provide for the orderly closure of coal-fired power stations. So has the Australia Institute, including advocating specific plans for phasing out thermal coal. We should also be contemplating more general measures. And here I'd like to refer to 2 that are mooted in Professor Ross Garner's book, Reset, where he argued for employment security through a national commitment to full employment. And secondly, for income security through a universal basic income. Let me come to the third pillar. I've already touched upon key aspects of the third pillar, fair and inclusive politics, through democratic planning, and in terms of emphasizing voice for frontline communities and social dialogue. I'd like to touch on 2 more. First, the central role of the state underlines the importance of public integrity measures. The government's technology, not taxes approach, in fact, involves substantial amounts of public funds. 20 billion over the coming decade, according to its plan. And this doesn't even include the regional fund promised to the National Party. Now, much of this money will be dispensed through the exercise of discretion, whether by ministers, government departments, or public agencies. There's clearly a risk here of the misuse of public funds, and robust measures need to be in place to avoid sports roads and car park roads being followed by climate roads. Second, the toxic influence of money in Australian politics needs to be eradicated. The Commonwealth is the most significant jurisdiction and yet has the weakest laws regulating political funding and lobbying. In the words of the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, we need root and branch reform at the federal level. In my 2019 Senate lecture, I proposed two 10-point plans, which you have up on the slide right now. One on the funding of federal election campaigns and another one on lobbying, to provide a sort of integrated scheme to deal with what is really a significant weakness in terms of Australian democracy. Let me conclude. The climate crisis should energize us rather than enervate us. It should impel us to devise, advocate, and implement a new democratic compact that gives effect to popular sovereignty, the will of the people, while safeguarding the health of the planet. Three pillars I suggest can underpin this democratic compact: a planning state, a solidaristic ethos, and fair and inclusive politics. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Joo-Sheong. That was really interesting stuff. I think Catherine mentioned at the start this podcast that we've been working on at The Guardian that was launched last week, Australia versus the Climate, which looks at Australia's interaction and engagement on the global stage on climate over the past quarter century. And there's 4 hours of it there if you want to listen to it all. It goes on quite a bit, so apologies for the plug. But there's clearly, like, one of the clear messages from it, there is a long history of short-termism and industry capture that we go to in great detail. And I think it's possible to have a recency effect on this when especially when you're a journalist, as I am dealing with the day-to-day. But I wonder if there is a case that could be made that those issues now are at least as bad and perhaps worse than they've been even at other times through our, really quite damaged political history on this subject. The net zero plan for 2050 that was released last week ahead of the Glasgow Climate Summit is quite remarkable in that it came with no white paper, no consultation, no public development process of the policy. No modelling has been released, though we're told it will be. And there are no new policies to get there, just kind of some funding for technology and the expectation that will eventually, much closer to 2050, to deliver the cuts that we need to make. And then we had this week in Glasgow, the minister responsible, Angus Taylor, the Minister for Emissions Reduction, launching his latest tech statement alongside the Chief Executive of Santos, an oil and gas company, which had a big stand at the Australian Pavilion in Glasgow. So interesting times. But I'm sure we're going to get to some optimism. Thanks for the optimism as well. We're going to get more to that. We might hear some from our next speaker, who is, I will introduce to you now. It is Zali Steggel, who I'm sure everyone watching is familiar with. She's the independent federal member for the seat of Warringah in Sydney's north, Manly. She's also Australia's most successful alpine skier, having won a bronze medal in slalom at the 1998 Winter Olympics and a World Championship gold medal in 1999. From 2008, Zali was a practicing barrister, and in 2019, she contested the seat of Warringah, taking on the former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, who'd held the seat for nearly 25 years, and she won with a 2-candidate preferred vote of greater than 57%. Really interested to hear what she has to say today. Welcome, Zali.
Thank you, Adam and Professor. If I could start Well, I'm delighted to be here to speak about this. The Centre for Public Integrity and the Melbourne School of Government Climate Change Democracy Forum. I mean, it's quite that's a big title and a big topic. But I would like to first pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging from the land on which I speak. It is contested, so I won't name, but I also recognise their sorrow and that the land was never ceded. And I hope that we can learn to live sustainably and tread lightly on this beautiful land the way they did for so many years, and that we can safeguard our prosperity, environment and our way of life. Yes, democracy, I would agree, is under pressure. We are at a crucial time in the world's history. Democracy as a political force is also under pressure. And actually, according to the Freedom in the World 2021 report, this year, democracy has suffered its 15th consecutive year in decline. And COVID-19 has seen the rise, I would argue, of authoritarian governments and policies as they have used the pandemic to crack down in new ways. And that has actually divided our societies quite a bit. It's exposed fault lines in liberal democracies because it really has exposed the inequalities, and they have exploded within countries. Many low-income earners were forced to endure lockdowns, which took their incomes, and it really was a very different outcome for different socioeconomic groups. Some democracies have simply failed to respond to the challenge, and thousands have died in those democracies. I mean, the United States, the world's leading democracy, was one of the worst in terms of its response. Social media, too, plays a huge part in our lives and is amplifying misinformation, and that is making governing a democracy more difficult and challenging. And I would argue those same influences have been very impactful on the climate debate. And at the same time, climate change is another forcing that is shaking up democracies and creating a real challenge to democratic governance. In the UK, Prime Minister Johnson just summed up the stakes at the last week's G20 meeting, saying the very fate of civilization is on the line. And I think in many ways, climate change is a test for democratic forms of government. Will we lurch towards anti-liberalism, authoritarianism on our way to net zero, or to avoid having to do the transitions we need to do? Will we fail altogether? Look, I tend to be optimistic. I'm a glass half full kind of person, and I am optimistic that we can actually reform and do the reforms that are needed. So the reform democratic institutions, and we can implement policies that can overcome climate challenge and other challenges facing democracy. I mean, after all, democracy has been tried and tested. It's delivered freedoms, opportunity, prosperity to billions. But it's not perfect, and it requires citizens to engage with it. Complacency and disengagement will see it falter. And I think that's throughout history, where the tests have been. And so currently the status quo in Australia in particular, and around the world in other liberal democracies, existing major parties want to keep the status quo. They are in power. The status quo works for them. They've encouraged the idea that democracy and politics is not for everyone, for people to get on with their lives and leave the business of governing and politics to them. But what that means is that's feeding a sense of disengagement from communities. And so then you have a situation where challenges like climate are not being addressed, and people are feeling a high level of anxiety and frustration at why is it not, is better policy not resulting? I certainly, some of the points that, Professor, you were making in terms of short-termism is something we see a lot. And I think it's a high level, one of the key areas of frustration for many people. We know climate change is a long-term crisis. This is a challenge. It strains the abilities, I think, of democracies to act, as a tendency in democracies is that it's policy based on short-term electoral cycles, and Adam, media has a responsibility as well, the 24-hour media cycle and national mood, rather than that long-term systematic planning to make sure that we actually do implement things for greater good. Just think about, obviously, as been referred to already, you know, the climate wars in Australian politics, how often Australia's shifted back and forth on climate change is, I think we are a case in point for a liberal democracy that is not engaging with the issue. We think back in 2007, there was a lack of action by the Howard government and the millennial drought. That in part defined that federal campaign back then. But that was actually the last time we had bipartisan agreement between Howard and Kevin Rudd in relation to acting on climate change. We then, of course, had the 2013 federal election where the carbon tax was one of the defining issues of the Abbott campaign. And I would say, whilst climate was a key part of the 2019 election campaign, the ground has shifted in the last 3 years. And what I suspect will be the 2022 federal election, I very much will be shaped by climate change again. And I think it will be in a different way, because what we're going to see, and I certainly hope, will be a rise of independence in safe Liberal seats in the cities because of the frustration of the major parties in engaging with the challenge. We need to overcome the short-term bias, and what's needed is a long-term anchored by accountability mechanism to keep the government of the day focused. The best evidence I received during the inquiry on the climate change bills was in fact why the need for an independent expert-based climate change commission is that it was actually described as an insurance policy for government, because it meant no matter who was in power in government on the day, it was actually experts that were recommending to government what the policy should be. We saw that through COVID, governments could explain quite draconian rules on our civil liberties on the basis of experts being able to explain the benefit that would be gained by those rules. And as a population, we on the whole accepted those. And as a result have gotten through the challenge of COVID in a very successful way. So it shows the benefit of that external expert-based advice from the government and party decision-making. If we think about climate change, I think the United Kingdom really did lead the way. They passed the Climate Change Act in 2008. It was bipartisan at the time, and it was first moved as a private member's bill, in fact, prior to their previous election. It's implemented a legislative framework. It enshrined a net zero goal in law. In the UK, it was initially 80% by 2050, and then they upgraded it to net zero as technology came online. It provided for emissions budget reductions in clearly 5 years, and importantly, emission reduction and adaptation plans, and a climate change commission to oversee action with regular review. And that accountability piece is incredibly important. What's been interesting is whilst the UK has been rocked by Brexit, and obviously they have also had numerous changes of prime ministers, the framework of the Climate Change Act has proved durable. It's survived the global financial crisis, it survived Brexit, as well as COVID-19 pandemic. And throughout all those crises, the UK government has remained focused on the issue of achieving their net zero by 2050 goal and delivering regular plans on how that will happen. In the 10 years since their act passed, they've actually reduced their emissions by 29% on the 1990 levels, and they're on track for 68% by 2030. Now, we hear a lot of spin about where Australia is tracking on its emissions reduction, but I can assure you we are not reducing emissions. When you put aside land use and land clearing, we are not transitioning away from fossil fuels. So it's clear that a framework works. It allows for regular planning. So to overcome short-term bias in democracies, I would argue strongly that to legislate the end goal and a clear framework to get there is essential. It's not enough just to commit to net zero. And so that's why I have been working pretty hard and pushing for and introduced to Parliament the climate change bills. I did it first in November 2020, and then also reintroduced it just a couple of weeks ago in the lead up to COP26, following the inquiry that we had into the bill that really gave every sector of Australian society, from the Business Council, from industry, from private businesses, to unions, to the civic sector, to environmental groups, the opportunity to contribute and say why this legislation would be helpful to their sector. I think a key thing that came out of it was the transparency and clarity of planning. In many ways, democracies can be inefficient in how they address policy issues, and in particular climate change, because of the regular cycle of elections. But also how one forms government. So in Australia, we at the moment, we have a coalition government, which is essentially it is like a minority government because it's a result of a deal between the Nationals and the Liberal Party. And there's currently clearly a secret deal in place between the Prime Minister and Barnaby Joyce and the Nationals in relation to their commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, I welcome that commitment. I've worked hard for 2.5 years to push them to it, but it is an empty commitment if it's not backed up with clear plans. But it's clear there's been some high-level horse trading to see that commitment from the Prime Minister be possible. And I suspect it will be in the billions. It's likely to include inland rail to support coal, or changes to Australia's environmental regulations and legislations, you know, that cutting of green tape to facilitate faster approvals of further projects. So ironically, a climate deal that will increase use of coal, accelerate approval process of coal or gas projects, this is the irony of democracy, that is possible. In fact, you know, I would say climate, you know, he's on the record, Minister Keith Pitt, Minister for Resources, he's, you know, a climate septic. He's been elevated to cabinet where decisions will be made on climate policy. And of course, the Australian public has been kept in the dark of what promises have been made. Clearly, the most equitable and efficient path to net zero doesn't include secret deals in party rooms or underdeveloped plans by government departments. We need to look at clear planning, and it needs to happen out in plain sight. If we look at the net zero plan by the Prime Minister, as was mentioned already by both of you, there's been no planning, no details, no consultation, no modelling, no costings. And certainly we did not see the Chief Scientist stand up next to the Prime Minister to announce that plan when the press conference was on. In fact, during the inquiry on the climate change bill, I asked the Department of Energy whether modelling beyond 2030 had been done, and at the time it had not. So I also asked, has there been modelling to net zero? And it had not. I asked the Climate Change Authority whether or not advice had been given to government, or had they been asked by the Minister to plan a pathway to net zero by 2050 or as soon as possible, as was the language at the time, and that hadn't been done either. And then finally, I asked the Department of Environment under Susan Lee, has at the very least a national risk assessment been done so that we can understand if we are not going to rise to the challenge and act on reducing our emissions and limiting global warming, what exactly is the risk? How are we preparing our communities? We can't have another situation of evacuations of communities from our beaches. You know, our first climate refugees were on the beaches, on the shores of Australia in the 2019 bushfires. And again, the Department of Environment has not done system-wide assessment of climate risk. They have not modelled what the current trajectory of global warming will mean for industries and environments. So it's clear we're unprepared. Government is absolutely failing the Australian people in terms of planning for what is our biggest risk and our biggest opportunity. But I do think reform is possible. Unlike authoritarian regimes where secrecy, suppression and anti-science base can be the rule, we are a democratic country. We can require reform, and reform that policy can be developed transparently and not just by party politics. And so I think that's, we can reform that we can mandate detailed planning, take into account everyone's interest, and I would argue not just the National Party. The UK have done it in their Climate Change Act, and I would argue the Climate Change Bill can do that for Australia. As has been touched on, there are vested interests in Australia. You know, our democracy is impacted by fossil fuel donations. In fact, fossil fuel donations have doubled in Australia in the last 4 years. And I think the effect is telling. We've got a complete lack of effective climate policy. But both major parties take money from fossil fuel companies, and this is particularly acute, obviously, in the Liberal Party. But Labor are just as guilty. We've seen with the Beetaloo cooperative drilling program where Empire Energy, had just attended a Liberal Party fundraiser and then is awarded a $21 million grant program for fracking wells in the Northern Territory. But sadly, when tried to stop that, both Labor and the coalition supported opening up the Beetaloo Basin for gas fracking. So we see that influence of vested interests in campaigning and lobbying against change. This is no different to big tobacco. The fossil fuel industry are the big tobacco of our time, and we need to be aware of that. The fossil fuel companies and the regulatory capture that's occurring has eroded public trust. And it's impacting sustainable economic growth, and it's trapped us in this vicious cycle of climate politics that have led to nowhere. But I do think we can change this. The biggest reforms in governance we've seen have been in times of minority government. And I do strongly have faith that we can form new coalitions, new alliances that actually put greater good and long-term planning at the centre of government decisions. I think that's why I'm here. It's a rise of independence in the political space. We have had a history of independence, but I think with the growing and acceleration of the climate crisis and the growing frustration at the inability of the major parties to engage with the problem, communities are re-engaging with democracy. They are re-engaging with the process. In Warringah, it was a grassroots campaign that really took, we were able to defeat probably one of the biggest climate septics that we've had in Australia. And I think we're seeing since then communities all around Australia really rise and engage with this process. We're seeing a vast number of community groups engaging. We see the rise of a group like Climate 200, which is to break down that last barrier to diversifying our politics. Nowhere does it say in the Constitution that we should have two major parties, that it has to be a polarised situation. I think diversity is good in the political system. The biggest barrier to entry has been finances and access to media. Now, we are in an era where social media gives you access to 24/7 mediums, and we are now seeing the rise of new funding opportunities through organisations like Climate 200, who are looking to help fund independent campaigns. So it's a movement. This is a movement which is about democracy. It's not about party politics. It's about representing communities and bringing long-term good planning. I do think, to finish on a good note, that democracy is adaptable and resilient. We can have science-based climate targets and policies. We can have good policy. We need integrity and transparency. There's no doubt about that. I think hand in hand with a lot of our climate policy comes integrity and fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility, which has been missing. So whilst there are many challenges, I am strongly of the view that it is as communities re-engage with their democracy and they think of the power of their vote, each vote counts, and your vote matters. And as people realise that, the more we will see that democracy can be remarkably resilient and can get back to being what it's about, which would be good governance.
Thanks, Zali. Thank you both. Really interesting stuff. A lot to think about there. I absolutely accept your passing reference to the role of the media, and we won't dwell, well, unless we have questions about it, won't dwell on that too much now, but it's certainly been a factor. We're keen now to have questions from the floor. We've already got a couple of really good ones coming in, so I might just ask one to get things rolling, and then we'll put some questions from the audience to you both. I'm going to put, I guess, what's slightly a devil's advocate question initially about the electoral possibilities of getting people to vote based on climate change to bring about the sort of change we're discussing. We've had a number of elections described as climate elections in Australia, and yet we are where we are in a policy sense. And I talked a little, and you talked a bit about where the government is, and also at Labor at this point, the alternative government is promising to do more, but we haven't seen much detail of what that would mean because it feels burnt on it electorally from the past. We see in polling, and a massive recent poll by the Australia Institute, the annual climate poll that goes back 14 years, showing 75% of voters, and it's a really big pool, the survey that they're drawing from, say they're concerned about climate change. And a growing number say that it would influence their vote. Yet we get the electoral results we get, and where we get people who get up on a climate change specific platform, or at least a climate-centred platform, such as yourself, Zali, it's in certain types of seats in the country, and also, I mean, where we've seen independents flourish, there's often been opponents who have become quite unpopular by the time they've been ousted, I think. So how do we get from, and this is a very practical question for an in part an academic discussion, I know, but how do we get in the short term electorally that level of concern in the community to become something that is actually election deciding, which we're still some distance from in Australia? What can happen to harness that level of concern in the community electorally to bring about change? I might start with you, Zali, on that.
Look, it's very true what you're saying, but I don't think there has been that awareness that climate is a challenge for now, right? That this is impacting us economically now. Cost of food, cost of insurance. We have whole areas that will be uninsurable because of the climate risks that they are exposed to, coastal erosion, drought, it will impact every way, and I think the 2019 bushfires certainly have moved that metrics in terms of awareness. But so the sense that it's also, an economic question. These are the awareness that this is a question for now, for this decade, not some problem of the future, I think has shifted. But like any movement, you have or any disruption, if we think of through our history, global disruptions, the disruption keeps growing until you reach a tipping point of enough people, on board with the disruption to then things accelerate. I do think we are in that phase when you look at the level of impact to how many communities. Electorally, it's also about choice. I mean, Australia has a great democracy with compulsory voting, but you can only vote for what's on the ballot box. And if you do not have choices that represent your community, people will fall back to habits, or they will fall back to what they know, least scary option. And we have very negative politics in Australia. No one's ever, between the major parties, they're never selling the benefits of their plan. It's always, we are the least worst option. You should fear the other side and we will be less bad. It's never about selling what can actually be achieved, what can be positive about it. But so communities have been, I think, stuck for choice because we really have not had much diversity in our political offering. We've had a rise of far-right groups, far choices. We've lost the centre. I think many, I would say, moderate Liberal voters feel very abandoned by the Liberal Party. I think there's a real crisis of character in the major parties of who they represent and what their values are. You see a Liberal democracy under a coalition government, theoretically a party of small government is interfering in the market when it comes to energy, is not letting free market principles apply, but is trying to prop up via the way of taxes, ultimately, extending the life of a technology that the market has moved on from and is saying is not viable. So I think, again, we've had independence before, I acknowledge that, but the barrier to entry for independence has always been cost and raising awareness, so being able to access the media. And we are now in an era where it is not just about traditional medias. It's not just about your local radio station, TV station, or newspaper, right? We have access to many more forms of communication. And I think that is going to open it up for choice. And there will be a lot more choice at this coming election. So I hope I'm proved right and people will vote. People need to understand your number one tool to deal with climate is your vote.
Joo-Sheong, have you got thoughts on that issue?
Look, I'm sure there are many. I'm not an expert in electoral math, and Zali's, much more experience and has more wisdom on this. I think my general comment is that I think climate action shouldn't be seen simply about decarbonization. Yeah, and I think it's really about marrying the decarbonization project with dealing with other societal challenges, particularly questions of economic security in this pandemic has brought to the fore. And I just think that while the criticism might be made that this makes the project much bigger than what it needs to deal with, but I think we need to be dealing this in a way, the movement for the Green New Deal, for example, and it doesn't have so much traction here in Australia, but the insight is that you need a new social, political, and economic compact to deal with this crisis. And I think that that's actually an important way forward. If we just think about it simply about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and just phasing out the fossil fuel industries without a plan for the future in terms of society, in terms of fossil fuel dependent communities, what their jobs or communities will look like, I think we're going to see more of the same, if not worse. I mean, Zali is quite right to point to the, I think, positive signs in terms of Save Liberal seats and independents running. But of course, we've got Clive Palmer, Craig Kelly running in Hunter Valley, in central Queensland, and so on and so forth. On platforms, as we know, it's really about climate skepticism. It's about pitting one part of Australia against another part of Australia and really stopping climate action.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm going to now go to some questions that have come in from our audience. The first is from Mariam Zulfa, who says that giving the people a voice is a good thing, but Australia is not a direct democracy like Switzerland, where citizens are given a constitutional right to initiate change. So unless a legal right is granted, it will all be talk. And then raises the question, is that correct, basically? And what are your thoughts, given that Australia is a representative democracy? I might start with you, Joo-Sheong, if that's all right.
Look, yes, of course, Australia is a representative democracy, but I think this really comes back to, I think we need to see democracy operating at different levels. Yeah, and I think one of the sort of, how do I say this, stronger notion of democracy to see it simply about bringing representation. So let me make it more concrete. One of the things I argued was dedicated plans in terms of the regions, or we're talking about particular industries and so on and so forth. Those plans should be based, according to ILO, to social dialogue, which means basically community consultation along the lines of what Zali's bill actually is advocating. And what you can see there is something more akin to direct democracy, where basically then the community basically has a say in terms of plans that would directly affect those communities. I think we need to see more of that alongside what are our traditional mechanisms of representation.
Zali, do you have thoughts on that?
I disagree with that comment. Look, I disagree with the premise. Well, I won't say the premise of the question. That sounds too much like the Prime Minister. Look, I'm aware of the system in Switzerland, but at the end of the day, in a representative democracy, each electorate votes. We have a process of preferences, and that results in a representative for each electorate. And what I'm more surprised at is the lack of engagement by communities, of the handing over by proxy of that vote, of that responsibility once it's done, and that people only engaging with it every 3 years when they have to vote, as opposed to really engaging with their representative on just why did they vote on each legislation, what is their accountability. Because what happens is this proxy handover to a party room that makes all the decisions without consultation with with communities and back to individual MPs. The most shocking thing I've observed is the lack of individual responsibility for the actions MPs on both sides take as part of a collective. So they think that if they just, they vote with the party because that's what they're told to do, but they don't think that they will bear any individual responsibility back to their electorate for that action. And that ultimately falls back on the community. They need to assess whether they are happy with that status quo or not.
Yeah, and comes back to, the level of engagement, doesn't it? Which is, obviously at the heart of so much of what we're talking about. There's a question here that really interests me. It's by Lena Rikilla Tamang. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Talks about, in reference to the discussion about short-termism, and given that politics is bad at dealing with intergenerational challenges, would lowering the voting age be part of the solution? Should it be part of the solution? 16 years of age, for example, or even lower? Start again with you, Joo-Sheong.
Look, I think it can help in terms of bringing the younger people into the electorate. I support the lowering the voting age, not so much because I think it helps in probably a minor way, and I'll come to this shortly, explain this in terms of the climate crisis, but this is just independent reasons why we might want to lower the voting age, right? Because even at 16, people are allowed to drive, they have jobs, they have all the responsibilities of adulthood, but are not able to vote. But I do think the problem about democracy is taking account intergenerational equity or intergenerational solidarity is one that cannot be dealt with through the franchise, because essentially we're dealing with people who have not been born. Yeah, those who are not born will not, by definition, cannot have a voice. So it's those who are living who actually have to have regard to those who are not yet to be born. So it's really, at the end of it, it's not about expanding the franchise. It's about an ethos we have that looks to the generations ahead and us as trustees for this planet, for this country, in the broad sense.
What about you, Zali? Laura,
yeah, I don't think that broadening the mandate by lowering the age is the solution. I actually think it's more about having fixed terms of government at federal level. We've seen that introduced at state level, like in New South Wales. I think to have a fixed 4-year term, I think would be much better at federal level. I think similar to the US system, limits to how long someone can be Prime Minister is probably a good thing. But I think it's, my difficulty with the short term, at the moment, no fixed terms at federal parliament means that, my experience was the first 6 months we did nothing, right? I mean, obviously I worked here in my community, but from a federal point of view, in terms of legislation presented, we really did very little. There were reviews and there was a lot of talk. We then, engaged in about a year of planning, but then, and legislation, but we had bushfires and then we've had COVID for the second year. And then we've spent about probably the last 6 months in a guessing game of when would the next federal election be. And it's very much, in control of, the incumbent controls the gameplay in terms of when the next election will be. And then obviously that dictates that the policies they are supporting are short-term policies to ensure success at the next election. So I think if you took the guessing out of the 4-year, the term, it would be much more effective.
Okay, the next question is from Richard Barnes, and it's directed to you, Zali, as a hypothetical. It's mid-2022, and in the recent federal election, the coalition was routed. Labor did poorly too, but it's been able to form a minority government with the support of the crossbench, basically some new independents plus those who are already there, and maybe a couple more Greens. How well do you think this government will function, both generally and particularly in responding to the climate crisis?
I think minority governments actually around the world are most productive because what it does is it forces collaboration in terms of you really can't have extreme views or extreme policies. It forces more accountability. So I think you would actually have a more productive government than when it's a question of majority. At the moment, we obviously have some level of checks and balances in the Senate, but we don't in the House of Reps, where government has a majority of one. And what we're seeing is a shutdown of debate. So, the question is, whereas fearing what a minority government might look like, it's actually look at how does a majority government work. And what it does is it does not ensure good law, it doesn't ensure good process, and it shuts down debate. So this is not democratic. So the truest form of democracy would be a minority government. But also remembering, I don't think it is the role of the crossbench to be kingmaker, right? It's not about, I think what we need to move to is new coalitions where we are forming a more centrist government. This is not about giving a mandate to one side or the other. It's actually about forming new centrist long-term policies.
I guess that kind of answers the question of whether either major party would actually accept a minority government with a crossbench. But we'll see how that all plays out potentially. I see I've got one more question I was going to direct to Joo-Sheong, but I see Catherine has reappeared. We got time for one more?
Yes, one more sounds good.
Okay, great. This is from Ben Pederick. He asks, the pandemic has demonstrated the transfer of power to more local state governments in a time of crisis. How can we address the complex and wicked problems of climate change through the crude mechanism of federal elections for general candidates? Do we not need to act outside government, recognising that the form it takes is going to change through crisis anyway, and start dedicating ourselves to new ways of expressing our voting rights, for instance, through citizen juries? I'll go to you, Joo-Sheong, on that one.
Look, I think citizen juries, or this is a mechanism of deliberative democracy. Many of you might be aware, where you basically have a randomly selected group of citizens, and they debate a particular issue. So maybe should there be a carbon price or not a carbon price? They receive information from a panel of experts, and then they deliberate and then reach a decision. Look, I think my view is that they have a role as a supplementary mechanism. And bear in mind, in fact, that this is casting back to history. I mean, this was one of the ill-fated ideas of the Gillard government to have a citizens' assembly to decide policies, climate policies.
I remember it well. It didn't
That's
last.
right. And I think perhaps there was an experiment that didn't take off. Look, they can be useful in particular ways, but I do think that at the same time, it's really about harnessing the strengths of our current mechanisms. And the reason why it's in this supplementary way is that given the costs are involved in terms, not just in terms of running something like citizen jury, but also in terms of time commitments of people involved, those that have been held can only involve a very small proportion of the electorate. Yeah. And I also think it's really important that we don't pretend that there are no interests affected. We can't abstract ourselves from this crisis and say, I'm not a mining worker, or I'm not a person that's going to be affected by rising ocean levels, and therefore my view is not going to be unaffected. It's legitimate in a democracy for those interests to be expressed, yeah, and be brought together, integrated into a package. So as a supplementary mechanism, yes, but I do think we should be looking at our main forms of democratic decision making and making them stronger.
Zali, do you have a view on that sort of idea, citizen juries?
Look, I think they can assist, and I think it's really important to have community consultation. So that's why, as mentioned, that's a clear feature of the bills, the climate change bills. I don't think they replace the process of government and departments. I think what we have seen, though, is a real reduction in staffing and knowledge in our key departments. And so we're seeing a politicisation of department heads and changeover to being advisors, which is, I think, a big problem we have in the public sector. But yes, I'm not convinced that it would create the outcome that it's thought that it would.
Okay, great. Well, look, that's been a fascinating chat from my perspective, and I'm sure, and hopefully for the audience. Thank you both for your time and thoughts and insights. And I'll now hand back to Catherine to wind things up.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Zali, Joo-Sheong and Adam, for a very stimulating discussion. Joo-Sheong, your point that debilitation does not spell despair, and Zali, your optimism that we can achieve reform is the message that so many of us need right now. And to have some framework for how democracy can be renewed to tackle the climate crisis is vital. May what we have discussed today be food not only for thought, but for action. On behalf of the Melbourne School of Government and the Centre for Public Integrity, thank you to all of you who have joined in today's discussion. If you wish to be informed of both organisations' research and future events, you can subscribe to our mailing lists at our respective websites. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.